Smoke rises over the harbour of Alexandria, and somewhere beyond the ships, the palaces, and the crowded streets, the greatest library of the ancient world begins to disappear from history. Was it truly destroyed in one terrible fire, or did humanity lose it slowly, scroll by scroll, through war, neglect, and forgotten choices? Before we go deeper, take a moment to like the video and subscribe if stories of lost civilizations, ancient mysteries, and vanished knowledge are the kind of history you enjoy. The smoke is the first thing anyone remembers, even if no one can agree exactly where it rose, how far it spread, or what it consumed. In the imagination, it climbs from the harbour of Alexandria like a dark tree, its branches twisting above roofs of white stone, above bronze statues, above crowded quays where sailors shout in Greek, Egyptian, Phoenician, Latin, Aramaic, and languages that never make it into history's surviving books. The sea is bright. The city is loud. Ships arrive heavy with grain, papyrus, glass, spices, ivory, timber, and rumour. Somewhere beyond the warehouses and colonnades, beyond the royal quarter and the palaces facing the water, there exists a place that has become almost too large for its own walls, a library that dreams of holding the memory of the world. The strange thing is that the most famous library in ancient history is also one of the hardest to see clearly. It is not like a pyramid, standing in the desert with its mass refusing to disappear. It is not like a ruined temple, its columns fallen but still measurable. The Library of Alexandria survives mostly as a wound in memory, a place known through scattered references, later retellings, fragments of ancient scholarship, and the enormous silence left by what did not survive. What survives in the record suggests something extraordinary, but the evidence remains incomplete. Scholars still debate its size, its exact location, the nature of its destruction, even whether the famous image of one single catastrophic burning is more legend than fact. Yet the uncertainty only deepens its power, because the question is not merely what burned. The question is what might have been preserved if it had not. Before we go deeper, take a moment to like the video and subscribe if this is the kind of history and a mystery you enjoy, because the story of Alexandria is not just the story of lost scrolls, it is the story of a civilization trying, for one brief and ambitious moment, to gather the scattered thoughts of humanity into one place, and to make knowledge itself a kind of empire. Imagine approaching the city by sea in the 3rd century before the Common Era, when Alexandria is young but already magnificent. The coastline of Egypt has always belonged to older rhythms: the Nile flood, the desert wind, the slow movement of grain from field to river to ship. But Alexandria is different. It is not an ancient Egyptian city in the old sense, grown slowly around a temple and a god. It is a deliberate creation, planned after conquest. Built where the Mediterranean opens toward the Nile Delta, its streets follow a grid, its harbours are engineered, its royal district looks outward toward the Greek world as much as inward toward the land of the pharaohs. On the island of Pharos, the great lighthouse rises, one of the wonders of the ancient world, guiding ships through waters that could be treacherous even for experienced pilots. By day, its pale tower catches the sun. By night, a flame burns high enough to become a star made by human hands. Below it, the harbour is a map of the known world in motion. Merchant ships from Rhodes and Athens, grain ships bound for Rome, vessels from Cyprus, Syria, and the Levant, boats carrying papyrus made from the marsh plants of Egypt, and perhaps cargoes from farther still, all crowd the waterfront. The city smells of salt, pitch, fish, oil, hot stone, sweat, incense, wet rope, and fresh ink. This is not the quiet, sacred silence people often imagine when they hear the word library. Alexandria begins as a port. and the library is born inside that noise. Its knowledge is not abstract. It arrives in crates, in diplomatic gifts, in private collections purchased at great cost, in manuscripts borrowed and copied, in poems recited by memory, in medical notes, ship logs, royal archives, mathematical treatises, temple records, travel accounts, plays, hymns, maps, and arguments. There is a lesser-known truth hidden behind the romance of the library. It was never simply a building full of books. It was part of a wider institution, connected with the Mausion, a sanctuary of the Muses, where scholars were supported by royal wealth. These were not lonely readers wandering between shelves in the modern sense. They were salaried intellectuals living close to the court, eating at common tables, working under the protection and expectations of kings. The word museum comes from this world, but the ancient Mausion was not a museum of displayed objects. It was a research community, a place where poetry, mathematics, astronomy, geography, medicine, grammar, and philosophy could be cultivated under one ambitious roof. In a way, Alexandria invented one of the most powerful ideas in human history, that knowledge could be collected systematically, compared critically, organized carefully, and expanded by people whose job was to think. Yet the city around it is never innocent. Alexandria is brilliant, but it is also unstable, competitive, and political. Its streets contain Greeks and Egyptians living under unequal structures of power. Its palaces hold rulers who dress themselves in both Macedonian ambition and pharaonic symbolism. Its temples speak to old gods and new claims. The library grows within this tension. It is a monument to curiosity, but also to possession. To collect every book is to admire knowledge, but it is also to control it. To bring scholars from across the Mediterranean is to honour learning, but it is also to make Alexandria the place through which learning must pass. From the beginning, the dream has a shadow. That shadow is what makes the later stories of fire so haunting. Fire is the enemy of papyrus, and papyrus is the body of ancient thought. A scroll can carry a poem for centuries if protected from damp, insects, careless hands, and war, but it is still fragile. It can be torn, eaten, misplaced, scraped, censored, or simply neglected until no one bothers to copy it again. Ancient knowledge does not disappear only in flames. It also disappears when a reader dies without a student, when a language loses its prestige, when a library's funding dries up, when a shelf is moved and never catalogued, when a text seems unimportant to one generation and priceless to another. No single explanation fully accounts for the loss of Alexandria, because disappearance is often not an event. It is a process. Still, the image remains smoke over the harbour. Perhaps it comes from Caesar's war in the city, perhaps from warehouses near the docks, perhaps from later violence in a changing religious world. Perhaps the great library was damaged more by slow institutional decay than by one dramatic blaze. The record is frustrating, scattered, and sometimes written long after the events it describes. But the symbol is stronger than the uncertainty. Alexandria becomes the place where humanity imagines all lost books going to die. And that is why the city matters. Not because it was perfect, not because it actually held every text ever written, not because its scholars were free from rivalry, arrogance, error, or politics. It matters because it shows the scale of an ancient hope. In a world of dangerous seas, fragile materials, short lives, and violent rulers, someone imagined that knowledge could be rescued from distance and time. Someone believed that a poem from one island, a star chart from another coast, a medical observation from Egypt, a mathematical proof from Greece, a royal chronicle from the Near East, and a sacred story from a vanished temple could all sit near one another and become part of something larger than any kingdom. The harbour keeps moving, Ships unload, scribes sharpen reed pens, scholars argue over words copied from older copies of still older copies. Outside, soldiers drill, priests perform rituals, merchants haggle, and the sea wind carries dust into the streets. The library is not yet lost. It is alive, ambitious, imperfect, and vulnerable. Its shelves, whatever their exact number, hold more than scrolls. They hold the dangerous belief that the past can be gathered before it slips away. Alexandria begins with a conquest, but it does not grow powerful by conquest alone. Its deeper strength comes from location, intention, and the peculiar ambition of rulers who understand that a city can be made into more than a fortress or a market. It can be made into an argument. When Alexander of Macedon reaches Egypt in 332 before the Common Era, he is not arriving in an empty land waiting to be invented. Egypt is already ancient beyond imagination. With temples whose rituals reach back through dynasties, priests trained in astronomy, scribes who know the power of records, and a landscape organized around the Nile with a precision that foreign conquerors rarely managed to ignore. But Alexander sees something on the Mediterranean edge of the delta that can serve a different dream. Near the small settlement of Rakotes, between the sea and Lake Mareotis, ships can gather, grain can move. And the new Macedonian world can fasten itself to Egypt's wealth. The city that takes his name is planned with unusual confidence. Ancient writers later describe Alexander marking out the lines himself, though details like that belong partly to the legend that grows around him. The evidence remains incomplete, but the broad picture is clear enough. Alexandria is deliberately placed to connect Egypt to the wider Mediterranean. It is close to the Nile without being swallowed by the river's shifting mouths. It faces the sea without being exposed as a simple beach settlement. It can feed on Egypt's agricultural abundance while speaking in the architectural and political language of the Greek world. From the beginning, it is a hinge between worlds, and hinges often make history because movement depends on them. Alexander does not live to see the city become what it will become. His empire breaks apart after his death in 323 before the Common Era, and Egypt falls under the control of Ptolemy, one of his generals. Ptolemy understands that ruling Egypt as a Macedonian outsider requires more than armies. It requires symbols, wealth, administration, and a story persuasive enough to hold Greek settlers, Egyptian elites, foreign merchants, and royal rivals in one political imagination. Alexandria becomes his answer. It is Greek in planning and court culture, but it stands on Egyptian soil, fed by Egyptian grain, enriched by Egyptian labour, and surrounded by the sacred authority of a civilization that had already outlasted many invaders. One of Ptolemy's most striking moves is not a battle but a burial. He gains possession of Alexander's body, diverting it from its intended destination, and eventually placing it in Alexandria. The dead conqueror becomes a political relic. In an age when kingship is theatrical, the corpse of Alexander is more than a corpse. It is proof, or at least a claim, that Ptolemy's Egypt is the true heir of the Great Campaign. A royal city needs a centre of gravity, and Alexander's tomb gives Alexandria a sacred magnetism in the language of power. Around that magnet, the Ptolemies build with extraordinary resources. Egypt's grain makes kings rich. The Nile flood, when it behaves, turns mud into food, and food into taxation, and taxation into ships, soldiers, stone, wages, and patronage. The royal quarter stretches along the harbour. Palaces, administrative buildings, gardens, temples, and enclosed spaces of scholarship begin to shape a world where politics and learning sit dangerously close to one another. The famous library does not emerge from a monkish love of silence. It emerges from the machinery of a state wealthy enough to pay for curiosity and ambitious enough to make curiosity serve prestige. Here the Ptolemies inherit several traditions at once. Greek aristocratic culture honours poetry, philosophy, debate, and the memory of Homer. Egyptian temple culture preserves records, rituals, medical knowledge, mathematics, and astronomical observations within priestly institutions. Near Eastern courts have long kept archives and scholarly texts, especially in Mesopotamia, where clay tablets preserve lists, omens, hymns, laws, and calculations. The idea of collecting texts is therefore not invented from nothing in Alexandria. What is new is the scale, the international hunger, and the royal project of turning collected knowledge into a public sign of dynastic greatness. What survives in the record suggests that the Ptolemies wanted Alexandria to rival older centres of learning, and perhaps to surpass Athens itself. This rivalry matters. Athens still carries enormous cultural prestige, but by the 3rd century before the Common Era, power has shifted. The successor kingdoms of Alexander's empire are larger, richer, and more bureaucratic. Alexandria can buy what Athens once grew. It can invite scholars, fund research, and collect manuscripts with the confidence of a monarchy. There is something almost modern in this, and also something very ancient, the realization that knowledge follows money, safety, and status. A scholar may love truth, but a scholar also needs food, housing, manuscripts, students, and protection from chaos. A lesser-known detail of this world is how much Alexandria depends on movement. It is not merely that ships bring scrolls, they bring people who translate, dispute, compare, and remember. Jewish communities in Alexandria become important enough that Greek translations of Hebrew scriptures are associated with the city's intellectual environment. Egyptian priests encounter Greek-speaking administrators. Physicians learn from bodies, soldiers, and older medical traditions. Mathematicians inherit problems from surveying, astronomy, mechanics, and abstract thought. Scholars still debate how deeply Greek and Egyptian intellectual traditions truly mixed in everyday practice, and it would be too simple to imagine a perfectly harmonious exchange. The Ptolemies create a courtly atmosphere in which learning is useful because it flatters the king. A ruler who gathers poets and scientists appears civilized. A ruler who possesses rare books appears universal. A ruler who sponsors the correction of Homer or the measurement of the earth announces that his kingdom is not merely rich, but refined. The library begins to take shape in this climate, where scholarship becomes a form of royal architecture. And so Alexandria rises not as an accident, but as a design. Its harbour gathers the Mediterranean. Its fields gather the wealth of the Nile. Its court gathers ambition. Its tomb gathers the aura of Alexander. Its scholars will soon gather words from every shore they can reach. The city is already teaching the ancient world a new lesson, that empire does not only march across land. Sometimes it sits beside the sea, opens its storerooms, pays its scribes, and waits for every ship to bring another fragment of the world into its hands. Once Alexandria has wealth, ships, scholars, and kings eager to turn learning into royal glory, the dream expands beyond anything a normal archive is meant to hold. The library is not imagined merely as a safe room for useful documents. It is imagined as a net thrown across the world. Every poem, every treatise, every law code, every sacred hymn, every medical observation, every history of a city, every explanation of the stars, every strange local story written on papyrus, parchment, or copied from older materials becomes, in theory, something Alexandria wants. The aim is almost impossible from the beginning, and that impossibility is part of its force. The Ptolemies do not simply want a great collection, they want the collection, the one through which all other collections seem partial. To modern ears, the idea of gathering every book in the world sounds poetic, perhaps even noble. In the 3rd century before the Common Era, it is also practical, competitive, and deeply political. Books are not mass-produced objects. A text exists only if someone copies it, and every copy is a human event. A scribe bends over a roll of papyrus, dips a reed pen, follows an older manuscript line by line, and makes choices with every stroke. A tired eye can skip a phrase. A damaged original can force a guess. A word in an old dialect can confuse a copyist trained in a newer one. A famous poem can survive in several different versions, each claiming authority through age, reputation, or geography. To collect books is therefore not only to acquire objects, it is to gather variants, compare traditions, and decide which version deserves to stand closest to the truth. This is where Alexandria's dream becomes more than accumulation. It becomes organization. A mountain of scrolls without order is almost useless. The library needs catalogues, categories, names, titles, opening lines, authorship claims, and systems of retrieval. Later tradition connects this work with figures such as Callimachus, whose great cataloguing project, often called the Pinnaces, seems to have classified authors and works in ways that influenced how literature was remembered. The details are fragmentary, and the full catalogue has not survived. But what survives in the record suggests an astonishing intellectual labour not just preserving texts, but making them findable, comparable, and part of a larger map of human thought. Inside that map, Greek literature held a privileged place. Homer was not simply an old poet. Homer was cultural bedrock, the shared language of education, memory, heroism, and identity for the Greek-speaking world. But Homer's poems had travelled by performance and manuscript for centuries, and different cities possessed different readings. Alexandrian scholars compared copies, marked doubtful lines, studied rare words, and tried to establish more reliable texts. This may sound dry, but it is one of the great quiet revolutions of the ancient world. The library made the past into something that could be edited critically. It treated even beloved poems not as untouchable relics, but as works whose transmission had a history. Yet the library's appetite reaches far beyond Homer. Alexandria sits at a crossing point where Egyptian, Greek, Jewish, Phoenician, Persian, Mesopotamian, and other traditions can be heard, translated, and reinterpreted. The city's book hunters seek drama from Athens, philosophical works from the schools of Greece, histories from local archives, medical writings from older centres of healing, mathematical works from Greek thinkers and practical traditions, and religious texts from communities whose sacred memory is bound to language. The famous tradition of the Greek translation of Hebrew scriptures, later surrounded by legend, belongs to this atmosphere of translation and royal interest in foreign knowledge. Scholars still debate the exact circumstances, but Alexandria clearly becomes a place where texts cross linguistic borders. Translation is one of the hidden engines of this story. It is easy to imagine the library as rows of scrolls resting silently on shelves, but before a text can truly enter a new intellectual world, someone has to carry it across the gap between languages. That work is never neutral. A translator chooses equivalence, smooths awkwardness, preserves strangeness, or loses it. Concepts rooted in one sacred or legal tradition may not fit easily into another. Technical vocabulary in medicine, astronomy, or mathematics can resist simple conversion. Every translation is both rescue and transformation. The library's dream of every book therefore carries a deep attention to gather the world's knowledge. Alexandria must change some of it into forms Alexandrian scholars can read. There are hints too of knowledge arriving from horizons even wider than the Mediterranean. Ancient trade routes connect Egypt indirectly with Arabia, East Africa, Persia, Central Asia, and India. Goods move more easily than books, but ideas travel with merchants, envoys, physicians, astrologers, and sailors. By the Ptolemaic period, Greek writers know something, however incomplete, about India and regions beyond the Persian world. Partly through the aftermath of Alexander's campaigns and later diplomatic and commercial contacts, it would be reckless to claim that Alexandria possessed a full library of Indian science or distant Eastern literature in any modern sense. The evidence remains incomplete. But it is reasonable to see the library's ambition as pointed outward, toward every shore that power, trade, diplomacy, or curiosity could reach. The material body of this ambition is papyrus, and papyrus is both Egypt's gift and its vulnerability. Made from the pith of a plant that grows in marshy regions, papyrus gives the Mediterranean one of its great writing surfaces. Egypt can produce it in quantity, and Alexandria can turn that advantage into cultural power. A scroll is light compared with a clay tablet, elegant compared with a rough wooden board, and suitable for long literary works. But it is also perishable. It dislikes damp. It fears fire. It can crumble under neglect. The library's shelves, however impressive, are never permanent in the way stone pretends to be. The entire dream depends on continuous copying. That may be the most important truth about ancient preservation. A text survives not because it is written once, but because it is copied again and again across centuries. The library could gather works from vanished cities, but if later generations stopped copying them, they would still disappear. The Alexandrian project is therefore both grand and fragile. It concentrates knowledge, but concentration creates risk. A great library can save texts by bringing them together. It can also endanger them if too much depends on one institution, one dynasty, one city, one chain of patronage. Still, for a time, the dream works. Scrolls arrive, scribes copy, scholars classify, translators struggle, cataloguers impose order on abundance. The known world, unevenly and imperfectly, begins to fold into Alexandria's rooms. Somewhere in that process, the library becomes something larger than a royal collection. It becomes a machine for remembering, and like all machines made by human hands, it can magnify human brilliance while remaining helpless before human weakness. Within the royal quarter of Alexandria, beyond the noise of cargo being unloaded and the salt wind moving through the harbour, the Marcion creates a different kind of world. It is not separate from power, because nothing funded by kings is ever truly separate from power, but it has its own rhythm. Here the day is measured less by market bells and military orders than by meals, lectures, copying work, calculations, disputes over words, and the quiet authority of scrolls arranged according to systems that only trained scholars fully understand. The Marcion is dedicated to the Muses, those divine patrons of poetry, memory, music, and learning. Yet its real miracle is practical. It gives intellectual labour a home, a salary, a table, and a community. The scholars who live and work there are not all alike. Some are poets who care about the exact shape of an ancient verse. Some are grammarians who examine language with the patience of jewel cutters. Some are mathematicians, physicians, astronomers, geographers, philosophers, engineers, and critics of earlier texts. The evidence remains incomplete, and no surviving floor plan lets us walk with certainty from one room to another. But what survives in the record suggests a place with lecture spaces, dining halls, collections of scrolls, gardens or walkways, and a scholarly life supported by royal patronage. It is not quite a university in the modern sense, not quite a monastery, not quite a research institute, and not merely a library. It is something earlier and stranger, a court-sponsored community built around the belief that knowledge can be advanced by gathering brilliant minds in proximity. Imagine the sound inside it. Not silence, but controlled intensity. Reed pens scratch over papyrus. A scholar dictates while a scribe copies. A mathematician draws figures in dust or wax, then erases them with the back of a hand. A poet recites a line of Homer and pauses over a single disputed word. A physician compares symptoms described in older Egyptian and Greek traditions. An astronomer studies records of eclipses and planetary motion, looking for order in the sky's difficult habits. Somewhere, a cataloguer tries to identify whether two scrolls are separate works or merely different versions of the same one. The work is slow, and much of it is invisible from the outside. Kingdoms celebrate victories in stone and bronze, but the Mausians' victories are often marks in the margin. One surprising detail of this world is how deeply scholarly life depends on correction. The library's scholars are not only preserving texts, they are suspicious of them. They compare copies, mark uncertain passages, identify lines they believe have been inserted later, and study unusual words that have drifted out of common use. In the case of Homer, this becomes almost a sacred discipline. A poem that generations have treated as cultural inheritance is open like a landscape full of traces, variants, scars, and older paths. This careful attention to textual difference may seem small beside the grandeur of the lighthouse or the wealth of the royal palace, but it changes how civilization remembers. It teaches readers that even the most honoured text has a history, and that truth may require comparison rather than simple reverence. The Mausion also gathers rivalry. A building full of scholars is never free from ego. Royal patronage attracts talent, but it also attracts competition for status, influence, and proximity to the king. Some scholars become famous enough that later generations attach anecdotes to them. Not all of them reliable. There are stories of sharp criticism, intellectual pride, and courtly manoeuvring. Scholars still debate how much daily freedom these intellectuals really had, because a king who pays for learning may also expect learning to serve his image. A scholar can measure the heavens, but he still eats at the king's expense. That fact gives Alexandrian knowledge both protection and pressure. The range of work is astonishing. Poetry is edited with almost forensic care. Grammar becomes a serious intellectual discipline, not a schoolroom afterthought. Geography begins to expand beyond travellers' tales into measurement and comparison. Mathematics develops through abstraction and proof. Medicine benefits from Alexandria's unusual position as a place where human anatomy could be studied with a boldness that shocked some ancient observers. Herophilus and Erasistratus, associated with the city's medical tradition, are remembered for anatomical investigations that pushed Greek medicine beyond speculation, though the exact nature and extent of their work remain debated. Ancient sources suggest that dissection, and perhaps even vivisection of condemned prisoners, may have occurred under early Ptolemaic rule. The possibility is disturbing, and no single explanation fully accounts for how such practices were justified, but it reveals something important. Alexandria's hunger for knowledge could become morally uneasy as well as brilliant. That uneasy brilliance defines the city. In one room, a scholar may be trying to preserve a fading poem. In another, a physician may be mapping nerves, veins, organs, and the hidden architecture of the body. Elsewhere, mathematicians explore forms that exist nowhere in nature, and yet explain nature with terrifying precision. The library's greatness is not simply that it stores the past, it creates conditions in which the past can be tested, corrected, extended, and sometimes overturned. The scrolls are fuel, but the scholars are the fire that burns without destroying, at least for a time. The daily life of these scholars would not have resembled the romantic image of lonely genius. It is communal, dependent, and structured. Meals taken together matter because ideas travel across tables as surely as across manuscripts. A casual disagreement over a phrase can become a treatise. A visiting scholar may bring a copy of a rare work or a method learned in another city. A royal request may redirect attention toward genealogy, history, astronomy, or the prestige of a particular cultural tradition. Knowledge grows not as a straight line, but as a dense web of habits, conversations, rivalries, errors, and corrections. At the centre of it all sits the relationship between memory and method. Older civilizations had preserved knowledge before Alexandria. Egyptian temples kept records. Mesopotamian scribes copied vast bodies of learning onto clay. Greek schools debated philosophy and mathematics. What makes Alexandria distinctive is the attempt to bring collection, criticism, classification, and royal funding together in one place. It is a machine made of people, scrolls, money, and ambition. It can gather what is distant, compare what is contradictory, and give scholars enough stability to pursue questions beyond immediate survival. Yet even here, surrounded by scrolls and supported by kings, the fragility is obvious. Papyrus decays, patronage changes, political favour shifts, a scholar's lifetime is short, and his work depends on students, copyists, and later readers who may or may not care. The Mouseion feels permanent while it lives, but its permanence is an illusion maintained by daily labour. Every copied line is an act of resistance against disappearance. Every catalogue entry is a small defence against chaos. Every debate over a word is a refusal to let the past dissolve into noise. And so, inside the Mouseion, Alexandria becomes more than a city with a famous library. It becomes a living instrument for thinking. Its scholars do not merely guard knowledge like treasure locked in a chamber. They handle it, question it, rearrange it, sharpen it, and sometimes wound it in order to understand it better. Outside, the harbour keeps bringing the world to Egypt's shore. Inside, the Mouseion tries to make that world legible. The library's hunger for books does not remain a quiet scholarly desire for very long. In Alexandria, collecting becomes policy, and policy becomes something that sailors, merchants, diplomats, and visitors can feel when they enter the harbour. A city that lives by ships soon learns to treat ships as carriers of more than cargo. They bring grain, wine, metal, spices, linen, ivory, timber, and slaves. But they also bring stories fixed onto scrolls, poems from islands, laws from city archives, medical notes from older schools, philosophical arguments copied in careful hands, plays brought for performance, histories written for patrons, sacred writings carried by communities that trust memory to ink. To the Ptolemies, each arriving vessel is not only a commercial opportunity, it is a possible library that happens to float. One of the most famous traditions says that books found aboard ships entering Alexandria were taken by royal officials, copied by scribes, and then returned to their owners as copies, while the originals were kept for the royal collection. The story is vivid, almost too vivid, and scholars still debate how literally it should be taken. It may preserve a real practice, or it may exaggerate Alexandrian ambition into a memorable anecdote. But even if the details have grown sharper in the telling, the tradition captures something true about the city's spirit. Alexandria does not merely wait for knowledge to be offered, it reaches for it. The library's shelves are filled not only by generosity and purchase, but by pressure, privilege, and the authority of a monarchy that can turn curiosity into command. This is where the dream of every book becomes morally complicated. There is beauty in wanting to preserve the world's knowledge, but there is also arrogance in assuming the right to possess it. A manuscript may belong to a family, a temple, a school, a city, or a traveller who has carried it across dangerous water at personal cost. In Alexandria, that private or local attachment meets royal appetite. The state has scribes, the state has storage rooms, the state has money, the state has guards. A visiting merchant may protest, but the city around him is not built to hear small protests against large ambitions. What survives in the record suggests that the Ptolemies could be aggressive collectors, and while no single explanation fully accounts for each story, the pattern is clear enough. Knowledge in Alexandria is treated as a prize worth pursuing with forceful methods. The copying itself is not a simple mechanical act. A scroll taken from a ship has to be inspected, identified, assigned to scribes, and reproduced on fresh papyrus. Good copying requires training, patience, and supervision. The scribe must understand the script, the language, and sometimes the subject. A medical text copied by someone who cannot recognize technical terms becomes dangerous. A mathematical work copied by someone careless with diagrams or numbers can become nonsense. A poem copied without attention to meter may lose the rhythm that helps reveal an error. The library's ambition, therefore, depends on a huge and often invisible workforce, not just famous scholars whose names survive. Behind every celebrated editor stands someone cutting papyrus, smoothing sheets, mixing ink, preparing labels, rolling finished copies, tying them, storing them, and perhaps never being remembered. The physical form of a scroll shapes the way knowledge is used. A papyrus roll is not opened like a modern book. It is unrolled horizontally, section by section, with one hand revealing and the other gathering what has already been read. Finding a passage can be slow unless the reader knows the work well or the scroll has been carefully labelled. Long texts may occupy multiple rolls. A vast collection therefore requires not only shelves, but systems tags, catalogues, opening words, author names, subject divisions, storage locations. Without order, abundance becomes a kind of darkness. The library's collectors can seize scrolls from ships, but the greater labour is making those scrolls part of a searchable universe. There is another lesser-known detail in the world of ancient books. Authenticity is always unstable. A text attributed to a famous author may be genuine, partly genuine, revised, misattributed, forged, or simply attached to a great name because great names travel well. This problem is not unique to Alexandria, but Alexandria magnifies it. When the library gathers multiple copies of a work, contradictions become visible. A tragedy may appear with different endings. A philosophical treatise may exist in a shorter and longer version. A historical account may include local additions. The scholars of the Mausion must decide what to trust. Their work is not merely collecting, it is judgment under uncertainty. The evidence remains incomplete, and many of their decisions are lost with the scrolls themselves, but their methods helped shape later habits of scholarship. This appetite for originals also reveals a sharp irony. Alexandria wants the oldest, best, most authoritative versions because it fears corruption through copying. Yet the only way to preserve a text is to copy it. The original may be prized, but it is not immortal. A famous old manuscript kept too long in a humid room can decay. A scroll stored carefully may still become brittle. A library can keep an original as treasure, but a living tradition needs duplicates moving outward. In this sense, the library's possessiveness may have both saved and trapped knowledge. It preserved works by bringing them into a powerful centre, yet it may also have concentrated too much intellectual wealth in one vulnerable place. The Ptolemies did not rely only on ships. Agents reportedly searched book markets in other cities. Royal wealth allowed Alexandria to purchase rare collections. Diplomatic relationships could be used to borrow prestigious texts. One famous story claims that the Ptolemies borrowed official copies of the great Athenian tragedians from Athens, deposited a large sum as security, copied the works, kept the originals, and sent the copies back, forfeiting the money, like the ship story. This may be polished by later tradition, but it expresses the same unsettling truth. For Alexandria, the most valuable book is worth more than ordinary fairness. Cultural prestige becomes a competition in which manuscripts are trophies, and yet, if the methods are troubling, the result is dazzling. Scrolls from many cities gather in a single intellectual climate. Works that might have remained isolated now sit beside rivals and commentaries. A local history can be compared with a broader chronology. A medical observation can be measured against another school's practice. A rare poem can be corrected against an older copy. A scholar can move from myth to geography, from grammar to astronomy, from law to philosophy, because the collection makes unexpected crossings possible. The harbour outside brings the world in fragments. The library inside tries to arrange those fragments into memory. Still, the sound beneath this achievement is always the soft crackle of fragility. Every seized scroll, every copied line, every tied roll placed in a cabinet carries the same warning. The world's knowledge is not a mountain. It is a harvest. It must be gathered season after season, or it vanishes. Alexandria's collectors understand this better than almost anyone before them, but their answer is also their weakness. They gather the harvest into one magnificent storehouse by the sea, where wind. Politics, war, neglect, and flame are never far away. A library supported by kings is never only a library. It may contain poems, star charts, medical treatises, philosophical arguments, and fragile copies of works older than the city itself. But beneath all of that, it also contains a claim. In Alexandria, the claim is clear: the Ptolemies are not merely rulers of Egypt by force. They are guardians of civilization, heirs to Greek brilliance, masters of Egyptian abundance, and patrons of a universal memory that no rival court can match. The library becomes one of the most elegant instruments of power ever created, because it does not look like an army. It looks like learning. It does not announce conquest with spears and shields. It announces possession through catalogues, scholars, translations, and shelves. The Ptolemaic dynasty has a problem from the beginning. Its rulers are Macedonian Greeks governing an old Egyptian kingdom whose religious, social, and administrative traditions stretch back thousands of years. They must speak to different audiences at once. To Greek settlers and the wider Hellenistic world, they present themselves as cultivated monarchs in the tradition of Alexander, surrounded by poets, philosophers, mathematicians, and rare books. To Egyptian subjects, they adopt pharaonic imagery, support temples, appear in ritual forms, and connect themselves to older patterns of sacred kingship. Alexandria, with its Greek street plan and Egyptian wealth, becomes the stage where this double identity can be performed. The library helps make the performance convincing. Knowledge gives the Ptolemies prestige that armies alone cannot provide. Other successor kingdoms can boast of battles, treasure, fortresses, and royal marriages. Alexandria can boast of owning the best texts of Homer, hosting the sharpest grammarians, funding astronomers, attracting physicians, and building a collection that seems to pull the world toward Egypt's shore. This matters because cultural authority can outlast military victory. A king who sponsors scholarship appears refined, legitimate, and almost timeless. His court becomes a place where the past itself is edited and arranged. In that sense, the library is not simply storing memory. It is helping decide whose memory becomes authoritative. The struggle with rival cities is especially important. Athens has long been the symbolic capital of Greek intellectual life, but Athens is no longer the centre of political power it once was. Pergamon, under the Attalid dynasty, will later become another major centre of books and scholarship, and ancient stories even describe competition between Alexandria and Pergamon so intense that the Ptolemies supposedly restricted papyrus exports, encouraging Pergamon to develop parchment. Scholars still debate the truth of that story, and it may be more legend than policy, but it reflects a real ancient perception. Libraries could be rivals. Collections were not neutral. They were monuments in a contest for cultural supremacy. The library's connection to power also shapes what is collected and how it is valued. Greek literature receives enormous attention because it strengthens the dynasty's claim to Greek identity. Homer, tragedy, comedy, philosophy, and history are not just beautiful or useful. They are cultural currency. To possess authoritative versions of these works is to place Alexandria at the centre of Greek memory. At the same time, the Ptolemies rule Egypt, and Egyptian knowledge cannot simply be ignored. Priestly traditions, temple records, astronomical observations, medical practices, and sacred histories form part of the deeper landscape around the city. Even if the library's dominant scholarly language remains Greek, the evidence remains incomplete, and it is difficult to know exactly how much Egyptian material entered the royal collection in forms Greek scholars could use. But the possibility reveals the strange layered nature of Alexandrian power. Greek kings ruling Egypt by gathering the intellectual prestige of many worlds. There is a quieter form of control at work as well. To catalogue something is to define it. To place a scroll under one author's name, one genre, one title, one category, is to impose order on a messy inheritance. The library's scholars do not merely receive the past, they arrange it. Some works become central, others become marginal. Some authors are preserved because they fit a scholarly tradition. Others fall out of sight because they seem less useful, less elegant, less prestigious, or simply less available. No single explanation fully accounts for why one ancient text survives and another vanishes. But institutions influence survival. A royal library can turn preference into destiny. For the Ptolemies, scholarship also supports administration and statecraft. Geography matters to rulers who depend on trade routes, taxes, ports, and military movement. Astronomy matters for calendars, navigation, and royal prestige. Medicine matters in a court where bodies are vulnerable despite luxury. Engineering matters in a kingdom of harbours, canals, temples, machines, irrigation, and spectacle. History matters because every dynasty needs a past that explains why it deserves a future. The library's most famous achievements may seem pure and abstract, but they sit within a world where knowledge and government constantly touch. The translation projects associated with Alexandria also carry political meaning. A ruler who orders or supports the translation of foreign texts is not merely being curious. He is making other traditions legible to his court. He is turning difference into something that can be read, stored, compared, and perhaps governed. The Greek translation of Jewish scriptures, surrounded by later legend, belongs to this atmosphere, whether every detail of the tradition is reliable or not. The broader significance is clear. Alexandria becomes a place where sacred memory can be transformed into a language of imperial administration and scholarly comparison. Translation expands understanding, but it also changes the balance of power between those who hold a tradition and those who study it from outside. The scholars themselves occupy an uneasy position in this system. They benefit from royal support, but that support is never weightless. A poet may receive food and housing, yet know that praise can be safer than criticism. A historian may have access to records, yet understand that dynasties prefer certain versions of events. A grammarian editing Homer may seem far from politics, but his work still enhances the court that pays him. What survives in the record suggests both genuine intellectual achievement and the unavoidable pressure of patronage. Alexandria's brilliance is real, but it is not innocent. This does not make the library less remarkable. It makes it more human. Civilizations rarely preserve knowledge for pure reasons alone. They preserve it because it is sacred, useful, prestigious, profitable, beautiful, dangerous, or all of these at once. The Ptolemies gather books because books glorify them, but in doing so they create conditions for discoveries that exceed royal vanity. A king may fund a scholar to decorate his reign, but the scholar may produce an idea that outlives the kingdom. Power tries to own knowledge, and knowledge quietly escapes. That is one of Alexandria's deepest ironies. The library is born from dynastic ambition, yet its legacy belongs to no dynasty. The Ptolemies want the world to pass through their capital, to make Egypt under their rule appear like the mind of the Mediterranean. But once texts are copied, methods refined, and ideas taught, they begin to move beyond their original purpose. A catalogue made for royal prestige becomes a tool for later scholars. A corrected poem becomes a foundation for literary memory. A mathematical proof written under patronage enters a realm where kings have little authority. The palace can pay for the work, but it cannot fully control what the work becomes. Outside, the harbour continues to shine in the hard Egyptian light. Grain ships depart, envoys arrive, royal ceremonies unfold, statues proclaim power in stone. Yet somewhere within the scholarly enclosure, a quieter empire is being assembled. Role by role, name by name, argument by argument. It is an empire without provinces but not without conquest. It conquers by collecting. It rules by organizing. It claims authority not over land but over memory. And because memory is one of the foundations of civilization, the library becomes one of the Ptolemies' most powerful creations, even as it remains one of their most vulnerable. The power gathered in Alexandria does not remain trapped in royal display. It begins to change the way people measure reality. This is the point where the library becomes more than a storehouse, more than a symbol, more than a trophy cabinet for kings who want to appear wiser than their rivals. Scrolls are brought into the city as objects, but inside the Mausion they become instruments. A poem can become evidence for the history of language. A travel account can become data for geography. A list of eclipses can become part of an argument about the heavens. A medical observation can become a clue to the hidden design of the body. Alexandria's deepest achievement is not that it collects the world perfectly. It is that it creates an environment where fragments from many places can be compared, tested, corrected, and pushed toward conclusions no single city might have reached alone. The figure who best represents this transformation is Eratosthenes, a scholar from Cyrene who becomes chief librarian at Alexandria, and whose mind seems almost impossible to confine to one field. He is a geographer, mathematician, poet, critic, chronologist, and astronomer. The kind of person later ages sometimes call universal, although no human being is ever truly universal. His most famous achievement is the measurement of Earth's circumference, and the story remains astonishing because it depends not on magic, myth, or divine revelation, but on careful observation, geometry, and trust in reason. He hears or knows that at Syene, far to the south near modern Aswan, the noon sun at the summer solstice shines almost directly down a well, while at Alexandria at the same moment, a vertical object casts a measurable shadow. From the difference in shadow angle and the estimated distance between the two cities, he calculates the size of the Earth. The exact details are debated, including the length of the stadion he used and the precision of the distance between Alexandria and Syene. But the principle is brilliant and firmly within mainstream understanding of Greek mathematical astronomy. It reveals a mind able to turn sunlight, shadow, distance, and angle into a measurement of the planet itself. In a world where most people experience Earth as local ground beneath their feet, Eratosthenes treats it as a sphere that can be measured from the edge of a shadow. There is something quietly breathtaking about that. No ship has to circle the globe, no mountain has to be climbed to the heavens. A stick, a city, a report from the south, and a mathematical imagination are enough. This kind of thinking thrives in Alexandria because the city sits at the junction of information. The kingdom has administrators who care about distances, taxes, roads, river routes, and grain shipments. The library has access to travel reports, maps, earlier geographical writings, astronomical observations, and mathematical tools. Eratosthenes is not working in isolation from the world. He is standing inside a system that gathers world knowledge and makes comparison possible. What survives in the record suggests that he also produced a map of the known inhabited world and worked on chronology, attempting to arrange historical time with a more disciplined structure. To measure space and order time are not small ambitions. They are acts of civilization trying to locate itself. Other Alexandrian scholars push reality open from different sides. Euclid, associated with Alexandria under the early Ptolemies, gives mathematical thought one of its most enduring monuments. His Elements is not simply a book of geometry. It is a disciplined architecture of proof, beginning with definitions, postulates, and common notions, then building proposition upon proposition with an almost stone-like logic. Much of the mathematics in the Elements draws on earlier Greek work. And Euclid is not inventing geometry from nothing, but arranging it so powerfully matters. a scattered inheritance becomes a structure. For centuries afterward, to learn rigorous reasoning is, in many traditions, to pass through Euclid's doorway. Geometry in Alexandria is not only abstract beauty, it touches surveying, architecture, optics, astronomy, mechanics, and the mental habits needed to separate what seems true from what can be demonstrated. In a city built on a grid, beside harbours engineered for trade, in a kingdom that depends on measuring land after the Nile flood, geometry is both pure and practical. That combination is one of Alexandria's signatures. The scholars may pursue ideas that appear removed from ordinary life, but the world around them keeps proving that measurement is power. Astronomy also advances in this environment, though not in a straight line toward modern science. Ancient observers inherit old questions about the wandering planets, the fixed stars, eclipses, calendars, and the relationship between mathematical models and visible sky. Aristarchus of Samos, connected with the broader Hellenistic intellectual world, famously proposed that Earth moves around the sun, though this view did not become dominant in antiquity. Scholars still debate how widely his ideas circulated and how they were received, but their existence reminds us that ancient astronomy was not intellectually timid. The geocentric models that later prevailed were not merely childish assumptions. They were mathematical attempts to account for complex observations with the tools available. Alexandria's importance lies partly in preserving, refining, and arguing through these possibilities. Medicine in Alexandria moves into even more unsettling territory. Herophilus and Erasistratus, working in the early Hellenistic period, are remembered for anatomical investigations that mark a turning point in the history of medicine. They distinguish nerves from blood vessels, study the brain, examine organs, and challenge older theories that rely too heavily on speculation. Ancient sources suggest that dissection of human bodies occurred in Alexandria, and some later accounts accuse them of vivisection on condemned prisoners. The evidence remains incomplete, and the most disturbing claims come through hostile or later sources. But even the possibility shows how far Alexandrian inquiry could go when royal authority, medical curiosity, and human vulnerability intersected. Knowledge here is not clean. It can illuminate the body while raising questions that do not fade. Engineering and mechanics also belong to this world of measured reality. Ctesibius, associated with Alexandria, explores pneumatics, water clocks, pumps, and mechanical devices. Later, Hero of Alexandria will inherit and expand a tradition of ingenious machines. Though he belongs to a later Roman-era Alexandria rather than the early library's golden age, the line between scientific curiosity, practical invention, and spectacle is often blurred. Devices that demonstrate air pressure or steam power may entertain, serve temples, measure time, or solve technical problems. It would be misleading to imagine an industrial revolution waiting fully formed inside these experiments, blocked only by accident. Ancient economies, materials, labour systems, and social needs are very different from modern ones. Yet the surviving traces show an intellectual culture fascinated by hidden forces, pressure, motion, balance, optics, water, and air. The library's scholars also transform literature into a science of memory. They study rare words, classify genres, establish author lists, and examine authenticity. This may seem less dramatic than measuring Earth, but it is part of the same impulse. Reality includes language, and language too can be measured, compared, corrected, and mapped. The past is not simply received, it is investigated. A line of poetry becomes evidence, a variant reading becomes a clue. A catalogue becomes a model of intellectual order. What makes Alexandria extraordinary is the gathering of all these habits in one city. Measure the earth, order the stars, dissect the body, prove the theorem, correct the poem, classify the scroll, compare the map, question the inherited text. No single explanation fully accounts for the burst of achievement. but wealth, patronage, location, competition, and accumulated manuscripts all play their part. The library gives scholars access to the memory of others, and the Halcyon gives them time to do something with it. For a while, it seems as if the world can be made legible. The sea brings reports from distant coasts. The desert gives clear skies. The Nile gives measurements, calendars, and wealth. The court gives salaries. The shelves give precedent, and the scholars, restless inside their royal sanctuary, turn shadows into planetary scale and fragile scrolls into systems of thought. Alexandria is not simply preserving civilization's past. It is teaching civilization how to ask larger questions. The first great wound in the story of Alexandria comes not from a librarian's neglect or a scholar's rivalry, but from the old force that libraries can never fully defend against war moving through a city. By the middle of the 1st century before the Common Era, the world that created the library has already changed. The early confidence of the Ptolemies has faded into dynastic quarrels, court intrigue, debt, Roman pressure, and the dangerous habit of inviting powerful outsiders into Egyptian disputes. Alexandria remains magnificent, still wealthy, still crowded, still proud of its Greek learning and Egyptian abundance, but its independence is weakening. The city that once tried to gather the memory of the world now finds itself caught inside the ambitions of Rome. Julius Caesar arrives in Egypt in 48 before the Common Era, pursuing Pompey after the Roman civil war has spilled across the Mediterranean. Pompey is murdered before Caesar can capture him, and Egypt's internal crisis draws Caesar into the struggle between Cleopatra VII and her brother Ptolemy XIII. The royal family is divided, the court is unstable, and Alexandria becomes a trap of stone, water, and politics. Caesar has soldiers, but not enough to comfortably control the city. The Alexandrians are not passive spectators. They resist, organize, and force him into a hard urban conflict near the harbour and royal quarter. The famous city of scholarship becomes, for a time, a battlefield. Ancient warfare inside a city is not clean. It does not respect districts of learning, religious space, private homes, or storehouses of written memory. Streets become barricades, roofs become positions, fires are set for tactical reasons and then behave according to wind, fuel, and chance. Ships burn, warehouses catch, timber, rope, pitch, oil, papyrus, linen, and dry packing materials become sudden food for flame. In this environment, the story of the library's burning enters history, though never as clearly as later imagination wants it to. Caesar himself, in the surviving account associated with his campaign, describes setting fire to ships in the harbour to prevent them from falling into enemy hands. Later writers connect this fire with damage to books. But what exactly burned remains one of the great uncertainties. The popular image is simple. Caesar burns the great library of Alexandria, and with it, humanity loses an irreplaceable universe of knowledge in a single night. The evidence is not that simple. Some ancient sources suggest that many scrolls were destroyed, perhaps in warehouses near the harbour rather than inside the main library itself. One tradition speaks of tens of thousands of books lost, but the numbers vary and may be shaped by exaggeration, confusion, or the symbolic power of the event. Scholars still debate whether the fire reached the library proper, damaged a daughter collection, destroyed books awaiting shipment, or consumed storage facilities connected to the book trade and royal collection. The evidence remains incomplete, and no single explanation fully accounts for the later legend. Yet even if the main library did not vanish in one dramatic blaze, the event matters. A warehouse full of books is not a minor loss simply because it is not the famous reading hall of imagination. In Alexandria, scrolls may move between harbour, palace, copying rooms, storage spaces, and scholarly collections. Books arriving by ship may be held near the docks before cataloguing. Copies may be prepared for transport. Royal possessions may be stored in more than one place. A fire in the harbour could therefore damage the city's intellectual infrastructure without producing the neat, cinematic destruction people later picture. The wound may have been partial, but partial wounds can still weaken a living institution. Papyrus makes the danger worse. A papyrus roll is light, useful, and elegant, but in a fire it is terribly vulnerable. It does not need a long siege to die. A spark, a burning beam, a hot gust through a storage room, and a work copied from a vanished original can disappear before anyone knows what has been lost. Fire does not distinguish between a routine duplicate and the last surviving copy of a historian's life work. It does not care whether a scroll contains a school exercise, a medical observation, a lost tragedy, or a map based on sailors who are long dead. War reduces intellectual value to fuel. There is something grimly fitting about Caesar's role in this story. He is not a barbarian raiding from outside the civilized world. He is one of the most literate and politically brilliant men of Rome, a writer, a strategist, a man shaped by the same Greco-Roman culture that admired books, rhetoric, history, and philosophy. If his actions contributed to the destruction of Alexandrian texts, it was not because he despised knowledge in some simple way. It was because military necessity, or what he judged to be necessity, outweighed preservation. That is often how knowledge is lost, not always through hatred, sometimes through priorities. The Alexandrian War also exposes the library's dependence on political stability. A collection can seem protected when kings fund it, soldiers guard the palace, and scholars work behind walls. But if the palace itself becomes a battlefield, protection collapses. The very closeness of the Mouseion library to royal power becomes a danger. What made the institution prestigious also placed it near the centre of conflict. A temple archive in a quiet provincial town might survive because no one cares enough to fight over it. Alexandria's library is endangered partly because Alexandria matters too much. Cleopatra's role in the aftermath is also tangled in later memory. Ancient accounts describe Mark Antony later giving Cleopatra books from Pergamon to compensate for losses in Alexandria. Though scholars still debate the reliability of that story, it may preserve a real transfer, or it may be a political anecdote shaped by Roman hostility toward Antony and Cleopatra. Either way, the tradition reveals that ancient people themselves connected Alexandria with book loss and replacement. They imagined libraries as objects of dynastic gift, conquest, rivalry, and repair. Books were not only read, they were moved as treasures of state. If the fire of 48 before the Common Era damaged part of Alexandria's collections, it did not end Alexandrian scholarship at once. This is important. The city continues to produce learning under Roman rule. Scholars still work there. The intellectual life of Alexandria does not vanish overnight in Caesar's smoke. That fact alone challenges the simplest version of the myth, but survival after injury is not the same as being unharmed. A living tree can lose branches and keep standing. A library can lose scrolls, catalogues, copies, patrons, and confidence while still functioning for generations. The first great wound, then, is both event and warning. It shows how fragile the great dream has always been. For 2 centuries, Alexandria has tried to gather the scattered mind of the world into one royal city. Then war enters through the harbour, and suddenly the dream depends on wind direction, ship timber, military decisions, and whether anyone can carry scrolls away before the heat reaches them. The smoke that rises over Alexandria may not be the complete death of the library, but it is enough to darken its legend forever. After the smoke of Caesar's war, Alexandria does not fall silent. That is one of the most important details in the entire story, because it resists the cleaner tragedy that later centuries prefer. The library is not simply alive one day and gone the next. Like a lamp blown out by a single gust, the city continues to breathe. Scholars still gather there, teachers still lecture, students still come to learn grammar, medicine, philosophy, mathematics, astronomy, and rhetoric. Scrolls are still copied, argued over, lost, replaced, and misread. The harbour still receives ships, and the streets still carry the mixed sound of Greek, Egyptian, Latin, Hebrew, and other languages shaped by trade and empire. Alexandria remains one of the great intellectual centres of the ancient world, but something has changed. The old world that made the library possible is beginning to thin around it. The Ptolemies had built the library as part of royal ambition. They had the wealth of Egypt, the prestige of Alexander's name, and the desire to compete with every older centre of learning. But after Rome takes control of Egypt in 30 before the Common Era, Alexandria's political meaning changes. It is no longer the capital of an independent Hellenistic kingdom, trying to prove itself against rival dynasties. It becomes a prized possession of Rome, a city too valuable to neglect but too dangerous to trust completely. Egypt's grain feeds the empire. Its wealth matters enormously. Its location matters. Its history matters. But the kind of courtly patronage that once gathered scholars under the protection of Ptolemaic kings no longer operates in quite the same way. A library can survive fire more easily than it can survive the slow evaporation of purpose. When a dynasty builds a great institution to glorify itself, the institution depends on that dynasty's continuing need for glory. The early Ptolemies had reason to spend lavishly on scholarship. They wanted Alexandria to rival Athens, to eclipse older traditions, to appear as the mind of the Mediterranean. Roman emperors and governors had different priorities. Some admired Greek learning deeply, and Alexandria remained famous for education. But the political engine had shifted. Rome did not need the library in the same way Ptolemy had needed it. That difference is quiet, but devastating. What survives in the record suggests that Alexandrian scholarship continues in many forms. Yet the shape of intellectual life becomes less tied to one royal institution and more dispersed through schools, teachers, temples, private collections, and later religious communities. The great centralized dream of collecting every book begins to lose its original force. The library may still exist in some form. The Museion may continue under Roman patronage for a time. But the early intensity of acquisition, cataloguing, and dynastic competition is harder to sustain. Scholars still debate the timeline because the evidence remains incomplete, and ancient sources rarely give the kind of administrative detail modern historians crave. There is no neat document announcing the library's decline. There is only a fading outline. This fading may be more historically realistic than a single inferno. Institutions die in ways that are often difficult to dramatize. A budget is reduced. A position is not renewed. A damaged room is not repaired. A collection is moved. A catalogue becomes outdated. A group of scholars leaves for another patron. A set of scrolls decays because copies are not made in time. A ruler prefers games, armies, or court politics to scholarly salaries. A civil disturbance closes a district for months. A generation later, people still use the old name, but the thing itself has changed beyond recognition. No single explanation fully accounts for the decline of Alexandria's library, because decline is made of many small decisions that do not look historic while they are happening. The Roman world also changes the geography of learning. Knowledge no longer needs to pass through Alexandria alone. Rome grows into a vast imperial capital with libraries of its own. Pergamon, Athens, Rhodes, Antioch, and other centres remain important in different ways. Wealthy Romans collect Greek books, employ tutors, and build private libraries as signs of culture. Education spreads through networks of teachers, rather than depending on one royal house. This diffusion preserves some learning, but it also weakens the idea that Alexandria must be the single gathering point for the world's texts. The library's original dream was concentration. The empire encourages circulation. There is a hidden contradiction here. Circulation can save knowledge by making more copies in more places, but it can also loosen the careful scholarly systems that made Alexandria powerful. A scroll copied in a private villa may survive by accident, While a better copy in an old public collection decays, a text valued by one school may be preserved, while another disappears because it falls outside the curriculum. Ancient survival is rarely fair. It favours what is copied, taught, quoted. Summarised, or absorbed into later traditions, works too specialised, too unfashionable, too difficult, too pagan for later Christian readers, or simply too unlucky can vanish without anyone setting fire to them. Alexandria itself faces repeated shocks. Roman politics brings unrest. Imperial transitions can turn cities into stages of loyalty or punishment. The Jewish community of Alexandria, once deeply important to the city's cultural landscape, suffers catastrophic violence during conflicts under Roman rule. Later, in the 3rd century, the wider Roman Empire enters periods of military crisis, economic strain, plague, and political fragmentation. Alexandria is not isolated from these pressures. Urban life becomes more fragile. Patronage becomes less predictable. Large institutions that depend on stable funding and safe storage suffer when the wider world shakes. The material problem never goes away. Papyrus has to be recopied. A library is not a tomb where scrolls can simply be sealed and forgotten. If a text is used often, it wears out. If it is never used, it may be neglected. If it is stored poorly, damp and insects begin their quiet work. If no scholar considers it important enough to copy, it can vanish peacefully, without violence, without witness, without even the dignity of being missed. This is perhaps the most haunting form of loss. Not destruction, but indifference. And yet Alexandria remains luminous. Even as the original library changes, shrinks, disperses, or loses its central force, the city continues to attract minds. Its medical schools remain respected. Its philosophical traditions evolve. Its mathematicians and astronomers continue to matter. Later figures, from Claudius Ptolemy to Hypatia, belong to different Alexandrias than the one built by the early Ptolemies, but they prove that the city's intellectual atmosphere does not vanish with one event. Alexandria becomes less a single institution and more a habit of learning layered across centuries. That makes the loss harder to define. When people ask when the library died, they may be asking the wrong kind of question. A building can burn in an hour. A scholarly ecosystem can take centuries to weaken. The library may have been wounded by Caesar's fire, altered by Roman rule, diminished by shifting patronage, broken by urban violence, and finally absorbed into other institutions and memories. Its death is not a clean line. It is a shoreline after the tide has gone out, where the shape of what once stood can still be seen in wet sand, but only for a little while. The strangest thing about the Great Library is that a place so large in memory has left almost nothing that can be pointed to with certainty. Alexandria has given the world a legend powerful enough to survive 2,000 years. Yet the ground beneath the modern city refuses to surrender a clear answer. There is no exposed hall of shells where visitors can stand and say, with confidence, this is where the scrolls were kept. There is no carved inscription on a surviving doorway announcing the library's name. There is no neat ruin like a broken amphitheatre or a fallen temple. No unmistakable foundation that allows the old dream to rise cleanly from the soil. Instead, there is a dense living city layered over a drowned, buried, broken one, and beneath it all, the traces of the library remain elusive. This absence can feel almost impossible at first. If Alexandria held one of the greatest intellectual institutions of antiquity, why has archaeology not found it? But the answer begins with the city itself. Ancient Alexandria was built on the edge of the Mediterranean, in a zone of harbours, palaces, warehouses, temples, streets, and royal buildings that have suffered repeated transformation. Earthquakes struck, shorelines shifted. Parts of the ancient royal quarter sank or were swallowed by the sea. Later construction reused older stone. Medieval and modern Alexandria rose over ancient foundations. People built homes, roads, fortifications, mosques, churches, markets, drains, and modern infrastructure over places that once belonged to the Ptolemies. The past here is not lying open under desert sand. It is crushed, flooded, quarried, rebuilt, and inhabited. Egypt often preserves the ancient world with astonishing generosity, but Alexandria is not the Egypt of sealed tombs and dry desert cemeteries. It is a coastal city of damp air, salt, crowds, and reuse. The same conditions that made it a great port make it difficult for fragile evidence to survive. Papyrus can endure for centuries in dry desert environments, but Alexandria's climate is far less kind. Scrolls stored near the sea, handled constantly, move through busy buildings, and exposed to fire, damp, insects, and neglect have little chance of surviving unless copied elsewhere. A library made mostly of organic material can vanish almost completely, even if the building that housed it once stood proudly in stone. The problem grows more difficult because the library may not have been one simple building. Modern imagination often pictures a single grand structure, a kind of ancient palace of books with endless shelves and marble halls. But what survives in the record suggests a more complicated institution connected with the Mausion, the royal quarter, storage rooms, scholarly residences, and perhaps secondary collections elsewhere in the city. There may have been book rooms, reading spaces, copying areas, archives, cataloguing offices, and storage facilities distributed across a larger scholarly complex. If that is true, archaeologists are not searching for one obvious library-shaped ruin. They are searching for fragments of an institution whose physical form may never have matched the later legend. The royal quarter itself is one of the great archaeological frustrations of the Mediterranean. Ancient writers describe palaces, gardens, ceremonial buildings, and the tomb of Alexander. But much of this district has been altered beyond easy recognition. Some of it lies underwater in the eastern harbour, where submerged ruins have revealed statues, blocks, columns, and architectural remains from the ancient city. These discoveries are extraordinary, but they do not solve the library's puzzle. A fallen column from a palace district can prove grandeur. It cannot, by itself, prove where scholars catalogued scrolls or where the chief librarian worked. Archaeology is powerful, but it is not magic. Stone can remain silent unless context gives it a voice. There is a lesser-known irony here. The library's fame makes the search harder emotionally, not easier scientifically. Everyone wants the discovery to be dramatic. A clear inscription, a sealed room, a shelf mark, a cache of carbonized scrolls, something that would allow the legend to become visible. But ancient urban archaeology rarely rewards desire so neatly. A wall may belong to a palace, a temple, an administrative building, or a later reconstruction. A floor may have been reused. A foundation may be impossible to date precisely. A beautiful column may have been moved from its original location centuries after it was carved. The evidence remains incomplete, and careful scholars must resist the temptation to name every impressive Alexandrian ruin as part of the library. This is why the library survives more securely in texts than in stones, and even those texts are difficult. Ancient authors mention the library, the Mausion, the Ptolemies' collecting habits, the scholars who worked there, and later episodes of damage or decline. But they do not provide the kind of architectural description that would satisfy a modern excavation report. They often write for literary, political, or moral purposes rather than archaeological clarity. Some accounts are late. Some repeat older traditions. Some compress events or exaggerate numbers. Some use library in ways that may refer to collections, institutions, or symbolic memory rather than a single physical room. No single explanation fully accounts for all the confusion because ancient testimony itself is a layered ruin. And yet absence is not emptiness. The missing building tells its own story about the fragility of intellectual monuments. A temple may survive because stone walls are massive and sacred space is remembered through continued ritual. A tomb may survive because it is hidden, sealed, and forgotten. A library is different. It must remain open enough to be used. It depends on furniture, scroll racks, labels, catalogues, copyists, and human traffic. Its most precious contents are meant to be touched, unrolled, read, corrected, and copied. The more alive it is, the more vulnerable it becomes. Its greatness is not locked in masonry. It is carried in perishable rolls and living minds. Modern Alexandria, with its apartment blocks, traffic, seawalls, and crowded streets, stands over the question like a lid that cannot simply be lifted. Excavation in a living city is slow, limited, expensive, and often impossible in places where people live and work. Underwater archaeology adds another layer of difficulty, because the sea preserves some things while scattering and eroding others. The library may have stood in a zone now deeply altered, partially submerged, or buried beneath later urban fabric. It may have left traces already destroyed before archaeology could reach them. It may have been dismantled stone by stone, its materials absorbed into later buildings whose builders cared nothing for the vanished shelves. So the search for the library becomes a search for negative space. Scholars follow references, study topography, compare ancient descriptions, examine submerged remains, reconstruct the royal quarter, and ask what kind of institution could have existed in the places still available to memory. What they find is not the satisfying outline of a single lost building, but a more haunting truth: the library was always more than its walls, and that may be why its walls are so hard to find. It was a network of patronage, scholarship, collecting, copying, cataloguing, and ambition. Those things can shape civilization for centuries and still leave almost no footprint that a trowel can uncover. The city keeps its secret beneath stone, water, and modern life, somewhere under Alexandria, or under the harbour's shifting floor. There may still be blocks that once belonged to the world of the Museion. Perhaps they will one day help refine the map. Perhaps they will remain silent. But the absence itself is part of the mystery. The library that tried to preserve everything has become one of history's most famous disappearances, not because nothing is known, but because the most desired proof remains just beyond reach. Where the stones refuse to speak, stories rush in to fill the silence. Alexandria's library becomes so powerful as a symbol that almost every age wants to explain its disappearance through a villain, a moment, and a moral lesson. For some, the destroyer is Caesar, careless in war and willing to let scrolls burn beside ships. For others, the destroyers are Christian zealots, sweeping away pagan learning in the name of a new religious order. For still others, the blame falls on the Arab conquest, imagined in later legend as the final blow against ancient wisdom. Each version has its own emotional force, each gives the loss a face, but history is rarely so obedient. The evidence remains incomplete, and the more closely the stories are examined, the less they resemble a single clean execution of knowledge. By late antiquity, Alexandria is no longer the Ptolemaic city of the early Museion, but it is still intellectually alive. It is also increasingly tense. The religious world of the Mediterranean is changing. Christianity, once persecuted, is becoming powerful. Pagan temples, philosophical schools, Jewish communities, imperial officials, bishops, monks, and urban crowds all compete within a city famous for brilliance and unrest. Alexandria has always been argumentative, but now argument is sharpened by theology, identity, and political authority. The old gods do not simply vanish overnight, and the new religious order does not arrive as a single peaceful replacement. The city becomes a place where sacred buildings, public honour, street violence, and intellectual life are all entangled. One episode often drawn into the library's story is the destruction of the Serapeum in 391 of the Common Era. The Serapeum is a major temple complex dedicated to Serapis, a god closely associated with the Ptolemaic blending of Greek and Egyptian religious forms. Ancient sources describe conflict between pagans and Christians, followed by imperial permission to destroy temples, and the Serapeum is dismantled under the authority of Theophilus, the powerful bishop of Alexandria. Later memory sometimes identifies the Serapeum with a daughter library, a secondary collection connected to the greater library. If books were housed there, their destruction would matter enormously. Yet scholars still debate how large such a collection may have been by that time, whether it still existed in meaningful form, and how directly the Serapeum's fall connects to the older Great Library. The uncertainty is crucial. The destruction of the Serapeum is real enough as a religious and cultural turning point. A major pagan sanctuary is broken, and with it, a visible part of the old religious landscape disappears. But the claim that this event destroyed the Great Library itself is much less secure. By 391, the original Royal Library may already have been diminished, dispersed, or transformed beyond recognition. The Serapeum may have held books, but it was not necessarily the same institution founded under the early Ptolemies. What survives in the record suggests continuity of learning in Alexandria after many supposed endings, but not continuity in the simple form later legend imagines. Once again, the story resists the satisfaction of one fatal hour. The figure of Hypatia often appears in this shadowed landscape. She's a philosopher, mathematician, and teacher in Alexandria in the early 5th century, a woman of extraordinary reputation in a world where most famous intellectual lineages are recorded through men. Her murder in 415 by a Christian mob is one of the most disturbing episodes in late antique intellectual history. She's dragged into a church and killed brutally. Caught in the political conflict between the city's prefect Orestes and Bishop Cyril's circle of authority, her death has often been turned into a symbol of science murdered by religion, or the last light of ancient reason extinguished by fanaticism. The reality is both specific and terrible. Hypatia's murder reflects urban violence, church politics, gendered vulnerability, and the dangerous closeness of philosophy to civic power. But it did not mark the burning of the library. It happened in a city whose older library institution had likely already changed or declined long before. Still, symbols matter because they preserve emotional truths even when they distort chronology. Hypatia's death shows that intellectual life can be threatened not only by fire, but by faction. A teacher's authority can become politically dangerous. A scholar can be reimagined as an enemy. A city can turn against one of its own minds. That does not mean that all Christian thinkers rejected classical learning. Far from it. Many Christian scholars preserved, debated, adapted, and transmitted Greek philosophy, rhetoric, medicine, and science. Some condemned pagan texts, others used them eagerly. No single explanation fully accounts for the relationship between Christianity and ancient learning, because it was never one relationship. It was conflict, inheritance, suspicion, preservation, transformation, and loss all at once. Then comes the later story of the Arab conquest in 642. According to a famous medieval tale, when Muslim forces take Alexandria, the conqueror Amr ibn al-As asks Caliph Umar what to do with the books of the library. The Caliph supposedly replies that if the books agree with the Quran, they are unnecessary, and if they disagree, they are harmful, so they should be destroyed. The scrolls are then said to be burned as fuel in the city's bathhouses for months. It is a dramatic story, memorable, morally sharp, and almost certainly unreliable. It appears in sources written centuries after the conquest, not in the earliest accounts, and it seems shaped by later polemics rather than contemporary evidence. By the 7th century, there is little reason to believe the original Great Library still existed as a vast intact collection waiting to be burned. This does not mean the Arab conquest had no consequences for Alexandria. Conquest always changes cities' administration shifts, elites relocate, institutions adapt or vanish, languages change in prestige, and old networks weaken. Some books may have been lost in the turmoil of late antique and early Islamic transitions, as they were in many periods of upheaval. But the bathhouse burning legend simplifies centuries of decline into a theatrical accusation. It tells us more about later anxieties, religious rivalries, and the desire to explain loss than about the actual fate of the Ptolemaic library. The competing destruction stories endure because they are emotionally useful. They turn slow decay into judgment. They allow people to say that knowledge died because one enemy hated it. But Alexandria's loss is more unsettling than that. It was harmed by war, weakened by changing patronage, reshaped by Roman rule, threatened by religious conflict, dispersed through shifting schools, and eroded by the ordinary fragility of books. Fire may have taken parts of it. Violence may have broken related institutions. Neglect may have done more damage than any mob. The truth is not less tragic because it is gradual. It may be more tragic because it means there were many moments when something could have been copied, funded, protected, or remembered, and was not. So the library stands at the crossing of fact and legend, and every legend reveals a fear. Caesar's fire is the fear that war will destroy what it does not understand. The Serapeum is the fear that religious triumph will erase older worlds. Hypatia is the fear that a city can murder its own wisdom. The Arab conquest legend is the fear that a civilization's memory can be judged useless by another age. Behind all of them lies the deeper truth that knowledge is never safe simply because it is valuable. It is safe only when people continue to care for it, copy it, teach it, and defend the conditions that let it survive. What was truly lost at Alexandria cannot be counted only in scrolls. Ancient writers sometimes give numbers so large they seem to belong to legend hundreds of thousands of books, perhaps more, depending on which source is followed and what a book means in a world of scrolls. A single long work might fill many roles. A collection might count duplicates, commentaries, catalogues, official copies, private donations, and texts waiting to be sorted. The numbers matter less than the silence. The real loss is not a figure in an ancient inventory. It is the absence of voices that once explained the world differently, remembered events from another angle, recorded experiments no one repeated, preserved languages now thinly heard, and carried entire traditions that later history can only sense by the gaps they left behind. The most painful losses are not always the famous ones. It is easy to mourn vanished plays by Aeschylus, Sophocles, and Euripides, because their surviving works prove how much greatness could fit inside Greek drama. Yet even here the scale is startling. The tragedians whose names remain were far more prolific than the handful of plays that survive complete. Ancient audiences knew dozens and dozens of works that modern readers will never see except through titles, fragments, summaries, and quotations embedded in later authors. Whole mythic versions have disappeared. Entire emotional worlds are gone. A character who once stood at the centre of a tragedy is now only a name in a list. A line that once made an audience fall silent survives because a grammarian quoted it to explain an unusual word. The rest has vanished into the long dark between performances and manuscripts. Comedy suffers the same fate, perhaps even more cruelly. Aristophanes survives enough to give a sense of sharp political wit, fantasy, obscenity, and public satire. But he was only one figure in a much wider comic tradition. The everyday laughter of the ancient world is one of its most fragile remains. Jokes depend on context. Satire depends on names, scandals, voices, and local tensions. When the texts vanish, a civilization loses not only its solemn ideas but its laughter, its impatience, its gossip, its mockery, its ability to puncture greatness with a rude little song. What survives in the record suggests that ancient comic literature was vast, inventive, and socially revealing. What does not survive may have told us more about ordinary attitudes than many official histories. Historians were lost too, and their absence changes the shape of the past. Modern understanding of the ancient Mediterranean often depends on a narrow chain of surviving authors, many of whom wrote from elite perspectives, political motives, or centuries after the events they described. Lost historians may have preserved local traditions from cities whose archives are gone, accounts of wars told from the defeated side, biographies of rulers now known only through hostile summaries, records of diplomacy, trade, colonization, revolt, famine, and disaster. The evidence remains incomplete, but it is almost certain that many historical works once available to ancient scholars no longer exist. Their disappearance means that later ages inherited a past filtered by chance. Some events appear important because the right author survived. Others shrink because their witnesses did not. The sciences lost works in a quieter but equally profound way. Ancient mathematics survives better than many fields because later scholars valued and copied certain texts. But even there the record is partial. Treatises by mathematicians, astronomers, engineers, and natural philosophers are known only by title or by references in later works. Some may have been wrong, some may have been brilliant, some may have contained observations that would now help historians trace the development of methods and ideas. A lost astronomical record is not merely a lost theory. It can be a missing measurement of the sky at a particular moment. A lost medical text may contain descriptions of symptoms, treatments, anatomy, epidemics, or surgery that would illuminate how ancient physicians learned from bodies and suffering. No single explanation fully accounts for what was preserved and what vanished, because survival depended on teaching traditions, copying habits, language shifts, religious acceptability, and plain luck. Medicine is especially haunting. Alexandrian physicians such as Herophilus and Erasistratus seem to have written important works, yet much of what is known of them comes through later writers. Their own voices are mostly gone. If their treatises had survived in fuller form, the history of anatomy and physiology might look very different. We might better understand how they described the brain, nerves, pulse, organs, and vessels, how they separated observation from theory, how far their research truly went, and how later medicine transformed or rejected their conclusions. Instead, they appear through fragments, praise, criticism, and reports that may compress or distort their work. The body was opened in Alexandria, but the books that explained what was seen have mostly closed forever. Geography too lost entire horizons. Eratosthenes wrote major works that survive only in fragments and references. Other travellers, map-makers, merchants, and scholars must have produced accounts of coastlines, river routes, deserts, mountains, peoples, animals, plants, and customs. Some descriptions would have been inaccurate, shaped by rumour or imperial fantasy. Others might have preserved real observations from regions whose ancient histories are poorly documented. The library's collecting dream mattered because local knowledge could enter wider comparison. When those texts disappeared, the map of human memory narrowed. The world did not become smaller in reality, but it became smaller in the surviving record. There were also religious and philosophical losses that are difficult to measure. Ancient Mediterranean thought was not one tradition but a crowded field of schools, cults, temple teachings, speculative systems, sacred stories, hymns, rituals, and arguments about the soul, the gods, nature, ethics, fate, and death. Many texts that once shaped communities now survive only as accusations from opponents or fragments quoted to refute them. This is dangerous for memory. A belief system known only through its critics is like a person remembered only by enemies. Scholars still debate many vanished traditions because the sources are uneven, hostile, or late. Alexandria may once have held works that would complicate every simple story modern people tell about ancient religion and philosophy. Perhaps the greatest loss is the loss of context. A surviving text without its scholarly world is like a statue without the city around it. Ancient commentaries, catalogues, biographies, glossaries, and critical editions helped readers understand how works were transmitted, interpreted, and disputed. Many of those tools disappeared along with the works they explained. The loss is therefore layered. We lost texts, and we lost explanations of texts. We lost books, and we lost the arguments around books. We lost original works, and we lost the catalogues that might have told us what was missing. Still, it would be misleading to imagine that everything lost at Alexandria was a masterpiece centuries ahead of its time. Some scrolls were probably dull, derivative, mistaken, repetitive, or useful only to a tiny circle of specialists. A universal library contains greatness and mediocrity together. But mediocrity can also matter. Ordinary documents show how people thought when they were not trying to be immortal. Minor works reveal habits, assumptions, technical routines, local details, and intellectual dead ends. Civilizations are made not only from genius, but from the vast middle ground of effort. So what was truly lost was possibility. Not a guaranteed modern world born 2,000 years early. Not a secret technology waiting to rescue humanity. Not the perfect wisdom of antiquity. Those are fantasies. What was lost was a wider conversation with the dead. More evidence, more disagreement, more human texture, more chances to see how ancient minds struggled, erred, discovered, doubted, and began again. Alexandria's vanished scrolls did not contain all answers, but they contain more questions than history now allows us to hear. Yet the story does not end in ashes, silence, or empty shelves. The loss of Alexandria feels immense because it gathers so much grief into one name. But ancient knowledge does not depend on one city alone, even when one city dreams of owning it. Texts move, students travel, teachers carry memory in their habits. A theorem copied in Egypt can be recopied in Syria. A medical idea shaped in Alexandria can reappear in Rome, then in Constantinople, then in Arabic, then in Latin. Altered each time but not entirely gone. The library may have tried to concentrate the mind of the world, but the mind of the world was never truly held in one room. Some knowledge survived because it escaped concentration. This survival is not graceful. It is uneven, accidental, and full of distortion. A work survives because a later reader finds it useful, because a school assigns it, because a monk copies it for reasons only partly understood, because a wealthy collector preserves it, because a translator sees value in it, because a fragment is quoted by an enemy trying to refute it, or because desert dryness protects a discarded scrap that no ancient scholar considered important. What survives in the record suggests not a smooth chain of guardians passing a torch, but a fragile relay through fire, damp, conquest, boredom, devotion, misunderstanding, and chance. Civilization remembers by limping. In the Eastern Roman world, later called Byzantine, Greek learning continues in ways that are easy to overlook if the story is told only as decline after Rome. Constantinople becomes a major centre of copying, education, theology, administration, and classical memory. Byzantine scholars do not preserve ancient texts as neutral museum pieces. They read them through Christian assumptions, educational needs, rhetorical training, and imperial culture. Some pagan works are neglected or condemned. Others are admired for style, logic, medicine, mathematics, or moral usefulness. Homer, Plato, Aristotle, Euclid, medical writers, historians, grammarians, and commentators continue to circulate because someone still has reason to teach, copy, excerpt, or argue with them. The evidence remains incomplete, and many losses occurred within Byzantine transmission too. But without these scribes and schools, the modern inheritance of Greek antiquity would be far thinner. The act of copying itself becomes a form of selection. In late antiquity and the medieval period, many texts shift from papyrus rolls to parchment codices, the ancestor of the modern book. This change seems technical, but it reshapes survival. A codex is easier to consult, easier to bind with multiple works, and often more durable than papyrus in many climates. But transfer requires labour. Someone has to decide that an old scroll deserves to be copied into the new format. Works not chosen may disappear. A forgotten roll can sit at the edge of a collection until it cracks, fades, or is thrown away. A change in book technology, quiet and practical, becomes one of history's great sieves. Monasteries also become unexpected vessels of preservation. It would be too simple to imagine monks lovingly saving every classical text they found. Many monastic libraries focus on scripture, liturgy, sermons, saints' lives, theology, and practical religious works. Yet within those worlds, classical learning survives through grammar, rhetoric, philosophy, medicine, astronomy, chronology, and the educational tools needed to read and argue. A monk copying a pagan author may not share that author's worldview. He may preserve the work because it teaches language, logic, or style. Sometimes classical texts survive under layers of commentary, abbreviation, or moral discomfort. No single explanation fully accounts for what monastic copyists saved, but their scriptoria became one of the narrow bridges by which parts of antiquity crossed into later centuries. There is a lesser-known kind of survival in palimpsests, manuscripts where older writing is scraped or washed away so the writing surface can be reused. Parchment is expensive, and an unwanted text can become the hidden body beneath a newer one. To modernize, this feels almost tragic, one age erasing another to save material. Yet palimpsests also preserve ghosts. Under prayers, legal texts, or theological works, scholars have sometimes recovered older writings invisible for centuries. The erased page becomes a tomb that accidentally protects what it covered. In this strange way, neglect and reuse can become preservation by disguise. Farther east and south, the story widens again. Syriac-speaking Christian scholars, Persian intellectual centres, and later the great translation movements of the Islamic world carry Greek learning into new languages and new arguments. In Abbasid Baghdad and other centres, works of philosophy, medicine, mathematics, astronomy, and science are translated from Greek, often through Syriac intermediaries, into Arabic. This is not passive preservation, it is transformation. Translators choose words for concepts that do not fit neatly across languages. Scholars comment, criticize, correct, expand, and sometimes surpass what they inherit. Greek astronomy meets new observations. Medicine is organized, debated, and extended. Mathematics absorbs and develops ideas from Greek, Indian, Persian, and other traditions. The ancient library's dream of gathering knowledge reappears, not as Alexandria reborn, but as a wider network of courts, scholars, paper, libraries, observatories, hospitals, and schools. Paper matters here. Unlike papyrus, paper spreads through the Islamic world and eventually into Europe, making copying cheaper and more flexible than parchment alone. Knowledge still remains vulnerable, but the material conditions of transmission change. A text that exists in more copies across more cities has a better chance of survival, though never a guarantee. Libraries in Baghdad, Damascus, Cairo, Cordoba, and elsewhere become part of a long afterlife of ancient learning. Blended with new traditions, some later legends imagine Alexandria as the single broken source of all lost wisdom. But history shows something more intricate knowledge survives through many smaller Alexandrias, temporary, fragile, ambitious, and always exposed to the next disaster. Private collectors and teachers matter as much as famous institutions. A single school text copied for students may carry fragments of older works inside it. A commentary may quote lines from a lost poem to explain grammar. A medical encyclopedia may preserve summaries of physicians whose original treatises are gone. A hostile theologian may save a philosopher's argument by attacking it. A dictionary may keep rare words from vanished plays. Ancient knowledge often survives inside works written for entirely different purposes. It is like seed caught in the fold of a traveller's cloak, crossing borders without announcing itself. Eventually, some of this inheritance reaches medieval and Renaissance Europe through multiple routes: Byzantine manuscripts, Arabic-Latin translations, monastic collections, Sicily, Spain, Venice, refugee scholars, book dealers, and humanists hungry for older texts. The recovery is real, but it is not the recovery of everything. It is a partial reassembly of a shattered mirror. Euclid returns with power. Aristotle returns through complex paths of translation and commentary. Galen and Ptolemy shape medicine and astronomy for centuries. Plato's works gain renewed life in Greek manuscripts, but beside every recovered name stands an army of absences. The survival of ancient knowledge is therefore not a consolation that cancels the loss. It is a reminder that memory is plural. Alexandria mattered enormously, but it was not alone. Its vanished shelves haunt history because they show what concentration can achieve and what concentration can endanger. The scattered manuscripts that survived elsewhere show the opposite truth. Dispersion can weaken a tradition, but it can also keep it alive. A scroll lost in Alexandria might survive in a copy made in Rhodes. A Greek treatise might live because an Arabic translator gave it a new body. A pagan argument might endure because a Christian scholar found it useful enough to dispute. So the story moves from the great missing library to the smaller hands that kept writing. The grand dream fails, but not completely. Across centuries, in candlelit rooms, court libraries, monasteries, schools, temples, workshops, and private studies, people continue the ancient labour of resistance against forgetting. They copy one more page, they repair one more binding, they translate one more difficult sentence, they preserve what they understand, and sometimes what they do not. And because of them, the silence after Alexandria is not total. It is tempting to imagine that if the Library of Alexandria had survived intact, the modern world would have arrived centuries early, as if steam engines, telescopes, vaccines, calculus, and electrical machines were all waiting in papyrus rolls, held back only by one disaster beside the harbour. That idea is powerful, but it is too simple. Ancient knowledge was brilliant, yet it existed inside ancient economies, ancient materials, ancient social structures, and ancient assumptions about labour, authority, and nature. A lost mechanical treatise does not automatically create factories. A clever device does not automatically transform a civilization that has slavery, cheap manual labour, limited metallurgy, and different incentives for production. The world that might have been is therefore not a fantasy of instant modernity. It is something subtler and perhaps more haunting a world with more continuity, more evidence, fewer broken lines, and a longer memory of how ideas developed. If more Alexandrian science had survived, the history of inquiry might feel less like a series of rediscoveries: Eratosthenes' measurement of Earth, Aristarchus's heliocentric proposal, Herophilus's anatomical work, Ctesibius's mechanical experiments, and the mathematical traditions around Euclid and later Alexandrian scholars show that ancient thinkers were capable of extraordinary abstraction and observation. Yet much of what connected these ideas has vanished. We often inherit peaks without the ridgelines between them. A surviving name appears brilliant, almost isolated, because the lesser works, failed attempts, debates, and intermediate steps are gone. If the library had preserved more of that intellectual landscape, modern history might understand ancient science not as scattered flashes, but as a deeper, more continuous tradition of method. The cost of lost continuity is difficult to measure. Knowledge grows not only through great discoveries, but through preserved mistakes. A wrong theory can be useful if later thinkers see why it failed. A careful observation can become important centuries after it was made. A technical vocabulary can help ideas travel more accurately. A commentary can preserve how one generation understood another. When these links break, later scholars must rebuild foundations that once existed. No single explanation fully accounts for the delays and redirections of human knowledge, but broken transmission matters. It forces cultures to spend energy recovering, translating, reconstructing, and arguing over fragments that might have been clearer if more had survived. In medicine, the loss may have been especially costly. Ancient physicians did not possess modern germ theory, microscopes, controlled clinical trials, or biochemical knowledge, and it would be misleading to pretend they were close to modern medicine. But Alexandrian anatomy represented a rare moment when direct observation of the human body challenged older speculation. If fuller works of Herophilus, Erasistratus, and their successors had survived and remained influential, later medical traditions might have had a stronger anatomical foundation. They might still have made errors. They almost certainly would have remained bound to theories modern science rejects. Yet the survival of careful anatomical description, surgical observation, and clinical comparison could have changed the balance between authority and evidence in later medicine. Scholars still debate how much such ancient work shaped subsequent traditions because the evidence remains incomplete, and that incompleteness is itself part of the loss. In geography and astronomy, a fuller Alexandrian inheritance might have widened the ancient map of the world and preserved more observations of the sky. Accurate geography depends on reports, measurements, corrections, and the willingness to compare local knowledge across cultures. Alexandria was unusually positioned to gather these threads. If more geographical works had survived, modern historians might know far more about ancient navigation, trade routes, climate observations, river systems, coastlines, and cross-cultural contact. Some accounts would have been distorted by rumour, imperial imagination, or ethnographic prejudice. But even flawed records can be valuable when read carefully. A mistaken map still reveals what people thought they knew, how far information travelled, and where ignorance began. Literature may be the place where the alternate world feels most personal. The lost plays, poems, histories, biographies, epics, and philosophical dialogues would not simply add titles to library shelves. They would change the emotional range of antiquity. Modern readers often build their sense of ancient Greece, Egypt, Rome, and the wider Mediterranean from a narrow surviving canon. That canon is magnificent, but it is not the whole voice of the ancient world. More texts might have revealed different political opinions, women's perspectives preserved indirectly or directly, regional traditions, minority communities, local myths, technical crafts, ordinary humour, failed philosophies, and forgotten schools. What survives in the record suggests that antiquity was far more varied than the surviving classics alone can show. A fuller library would not give the past back completely, but it would make it less narrow. There is also the question of cultural memory beyond the Greek-speaking elite. Alexandria stood in Egypt, a land with its own deep-written traditions, priestly archives, ritual knowledge, historical records, mathematics, medicine, and astronomy. Yet much of what modern people know about Egyptian thought comes through monuments, tombs, temple inscriptions, administrative papyri, later summaries, and the difficult survival of texts under very particular conditions. If the Alexandrian project preserved and translated more Egyptian material, the relationship between Greek and Egyptian knowledge might look very different. The same may be true for Jewish, Near Eastern, Persian, and other traditions that touch the city through trade, migration, diplomacy, and conquest. The library that could have changed the world might have done so not by accelerating machines, but by preserving the complexity of ancient cultural exchange. Still, caution is necessary. Lost books do not guarantee lost revolutions. Some works may have been derivative. Some may have contained errors repeated with confidence. Some may have reinforced old authorities rather than challenged them. A larger surviving ancient record might even have slowed certain changes if later scholars treated it too reverently. Knowledge can liberate, but it can also become weight. The prestige of ancient authorities shaped medieval and early modern thought in powerful ways, sometimes helping inquiry, sometimes constraining it. More ancient texts might have produced more inspiration, but also more arguments, more inherited mistakes, and more reverence for old systems that needed to be broken. The real possibility is not that Alexandria held the secret key to a modern world unborn. It is that it held more pathways, more branches, more beginnings that did not have to end in silence. If the library and its scholarly ecosystem had endured with stronger continuity, later civilizations might have inherited a richer archive of methods how to compare manuscripts, how to gather observations, how to organize knowledge across languages, how to question inherited texts, how to connect measurement with theory. Those habits are sometimes more important than any single discovery. A civilization changes when it learns not only facts, but ways of finding and correcting facts. And perhaps that is the most realistic measure of what could have changed. Alexandria's greatest gift was not any one scroll. It was a model of intellectual ambition: collect widely, compare carefully, preserve deliberately, support scholars, and treat knowledge as something larger than immediate use. The tragedy is that the model itself proved fragile. It depended on kings, wealth, peace, materials, and institutions that time did not preserve. The world that might have been is not a world where ancient steam engines roar across Roman railways. It is a world where fewer bridges collapsed between minds, where later generations heard more clearly what earlier generations had tried to say, and where the long conversation of humanity had fewer missing pages. Alexandria's library endures because it is both real and unreachable. It was a historical institution, or more precisely a cluster of institutions, royal collections, scholarly practices, catalogues, copy rooms, and intellectual ambitions centered in one of the most remarkable cities of antiquity. Yet it's also a symbol that has grown larger than its stones, larger than its scrolls, and perhaps larger than anything the Ptolemies themselves imagined. The library becomes the shape people give to a universal human fear that the best of what has been thought, written, measured, remembered, and wondered may vanish before anyone understands its value. Every age has its own Alexandria, and every age believes it is wiser than the one that let the fire spread. Its unfinished shadow falls across modern libraries, archives, museums, universities, laboratories, and digital networks. Whenever people gather manuscripts in climate-controlled rooms, scan fragile pages, catalogue endangered languages, preserve oral histories, protect archaeological records, or back up data across continents, they are acting inside the same ancient tension. Knowledge wants to be gathered, but gathering creates vulnerability. Knowledge wants to spread, but spreading creates distortion. Knowledge wants to survive unchanged, but survival often requires translation, copying, reformatting, and reinterpretation. Alexandria's dream did not fail because the dream was foolish. It failed because no human system can escape time without constant care. The modern world has built memory on a scale the Ptolemies could never have imagined. A small device can hold more text than the ancient library's largest legendary estimates. Satellites map the planet more precisely than Eratosthenes could have dreamed. Medical imaging sees through the body without the knife. Astronomers measure galaxies whose light began travelling before human beings existed. But abundance has not ended fragility. A papyrus scroll could burn. A server can fail. A language can stop being spoken. A database can become unreadable. A government can censor. A war can erase archives. A flood can drown a museum basement. A generation can decide that some memory is inconvenient. And another generation can discover too late that inconvenience was evidence. That is why Alexandria remains so unsettling. It reminds us that knowledge is not preserved by importance alone. The greatest poem can disappear if no one copies it. The most careful observation can vanish if it is stored in the wrong room. The most brilliant method can be forgotten if institutions collapse around it. What survives in the record suggests that ancient scholars understood this, at least partly. They catalogued, compared, corrected, copied, and collected because they knew the world was always leaking memory. They could not stop the leak forever, but for a time they slowed it. The library's legacy is therefore not only grief, it is also instruction. It teaches that scholarship needs shelter, but also freedom from the vanity of rulers. It teaches that preservation must be active, not ceremonial. It teaches that no single city, empire, language, technology, or institution should be trusted as the only keeper of human memory. The scattered survival of ancient learning through Byzantine scribes, Arabic translators, monasteries, private collectors, schools, and damaged manuscripts proves that redundancy is a kind of wisdom. Alexandria gathered magnificently, but the fragments that escaped into many hands became the fragments most likely to live. And still, there is beauty in the original ambition. To imagine every book gathered was impossible, but civilization often advances through impossible ideals that become practical habits. The Ptolemies did not collect the whole world, but they helped create a model of organized inquiry. They did not preserve every voice, but they gave scholars tools to compare voices. They did not defeat time, but they forced time to struggle harder. A royal project born from prestige became something larger than prestige. Because once knowledge is copied and taught, it begins to belong to minds beyond the court that paid for it. The ruins remain missing, and perhaps that is fitting. The library was never only a building. It was a pattern of human behaviour, the desire to rescue thought from distance, error, and death. Its shadow is unfinished because the work is unfinished. Every archive still has gaps. Every history still has silences. Every generation inherits not the past itself, but a damaged selection of the past, patched together from what survived and what someone cared enough to transmit. Alexandria does not ask us only to mourn lost scrolls. It asks us to notice the scrolls still burning quietly all around us, in neglected languages, endangered sites, fragile ecosystems of memory, and truths no one has yet thought to save. The city by the harbour is gone and not gone. Its ancient streets lie under modern life, under stone, water, traffic, salt, and rumour. The lighthouse has fallen. The palaces are scattered. The tomb of Alexander remains undiscovered. The library has become a question with no final room to enter, but the question itself survives, and perhaps that is the deepest legacy of all. Alexandria teaches that civilization is not measured only by what it builds in stone. It is measured by what it tries to remember, how carefully it doubts, how generously it copies, and how bravely it protects the fragile bridge between one mind and another. The wind down begins not with fire, but with the sea. Long after the scholars are gone, long after the kings have lost their names to coins and broken inscriptions, the Mediterranean continues to move against the shore of Alexandria. It lifts and lowers itself with the same patient rhythm that once carried ships into the harbour, ships heavy with grain, glass, oil, cedar, rumour, and scrolls wrapped against the damp. The water does not remember in the way people remember. It keeps no catalogue. It does not distinguish between a palace stone, a fisherman's weight, a fallen statue, or the dust of a book no hand will ever open again. It receives everything, slowly, and makes all things quiet. Somewhere in that silence, the old dream remains, not as a room filled with perfect shelves, not as a lost machine that could have saved the world, but as a human gesture repeated across centuries. A hand reaches toward a fragile page. A reader leans closer to a fading line. A translator pauses over a word that does not want to cross into another language. A teacher gives an old idea to a younger mind. A scholar admits that the evidence remains incomplete, then keeps searching anyway. These are small acts, almost invisible beside the drama of kings and fires, but they are the acts by which civilization survives itself. The ancient library that could have changed the world may not have changed it in the way legend imagines. It did not prevent war. It did not preserve every poem. It did not carry humanity unbroken into wisdom. But it changed the shape of longing. It showed that people once believed the memory of the world was worth gathering, worth copying, worth ordering, worth arguing over, worth protecting from the dark. And even when the shelves vanished, that belief did not vanish with them. So the final image is not only smoke over Alexandria, it is a lamp near a desk. It is a scroll being unrolled carefully in a room where a dust turns gold in the afternoon light. It is the harbour beyond the walls, bright and restless, bringing more fragments than any library can hold. It is a city trying to catch the past before it slips away, knowing it cannot catch everything and reaching anyway.